Montana Territory. August 1884, the train's whistle screamed through the canyon just as the cowboy spotted the girl tied to the tracks. Paxton Greer's blood ran cold. He was riding hard along the ridge, dust rising behind him, when he caught the glint of something white against the iron rails. He reined in his horse fast. The woman was thrashing, gagged, wrists bound tight with rope to the track just past the bend. No time to hesitate. "Go, boy," he shouted, digging his heels into his chestnut gelding. The train was coming fast. Too fast. He was off his horse before it stopped moving, knife already in hand. The woman's eyes met his wild and terrified. She could not scream, but her body jolted in panic. The tracks trembled under them. "I got you," he said fast, slicing through the rope. "Hold still." He yanked her clear just as the train thundered past, close enough he could feel the heat off the engine. They hit the dirt hard, with her landing half on top of him, both of them gasping. The woman blinked up at him, chest heaving. Her long, dark hair was full of dust, cheeks streaked with tears. "You all right?" he asked, voice low, steady. She nodded, but her hands were shaking as she pulled the gag from her mouth. "I think so," she whispered. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die. I was not about to let that happen." Her voice cracked. "Who ties a person to a train track like that?" "That is what I would like to know," Paxton said, helping her sit up. She looked around, dazed. "My name's Vienna." "Vienna Price." "Paxton Greer." She reached for his arm as if needing to feel something solid. "Thank you, Paxton." He nodded, jaw tight, eyes scanning the hills. No sign of whoever had done this. But someone had gone to great lengths to try and kill her. He helped her to his horse. "My homestead's only a few miles west. You can rest up there and we will figure out what happened." Vienna hesitated, eyes flicking to the saddle. "I can ride." "Not today, you cannot," he said gently. "Let me help." She settled in front of him, arms stiff. But as the horse moved and the silence stretched long, she leaned back just slightly against him. By the time they reached his land, an old log house tucked between pine trees, and a wide stretch of gold grass, her head was resting on his shoulder. Paxton carried her inside. "Sit here," he said, guiding her to the armchair by the hearth. The place was simple but clean. A rifle hung above the mantel. A half-finished wood carving sat on the table. He moved around her quietly, getting water, bandages, bread. She watched him with tired, wary eyes. "You live out here alone," he nodded. "Used to be more of us, but life has a way of thinning things out." Vienna looked down at her scraped wrists. "You saved my life." "You do not owe me anything," he said, kneeling to clean the cuts. She swallowed hard. "I do not know why someone would do this to me. You remember anything before it happened?" "I was riding from Bozeman. My aunt got sick and I went to help. I stopped at her rest stop near the canyon. Someone must have followed me." She swallowed again. "I woke up tied to those rails." Paxton's jaw set. "You are safe now." She studied his face for a long moment. "You were not afraid." "I was scared as hell," he admitted, "but I was not going to leave you." For a while they sat quiet. The wind shifted outside. Vienna's eyes drifted shut, her body finally loosening in the chair. He tucked a blanket around her. The next morning she woke with a start, sitting up fast. "You are all right," he said from the kitchen. Vienna looked around, disoriented. Then her eyes found him. "I forgot where I was for a second. You are at my place. I made coffee. There is bread and eggs on the table. Thank you." They ate in silence for a while, then Vienna looked up. "Why are you out here all alone, Paxton?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I was in the war, came home to nothing. Family gone, land empty. I rebuilt what I could. That is hard. Everyone out here's got a story. Mine is just quieter than most." She folded her hands. "I do not have anywhere to go right now. Not until I figure out who did this." "You can stay here as long as you need," he said without looking up. She studied him. "You do not even know me." "I know you are alive because you fought to be. That is enough for now." Later that afternoon, Paxton rode into town to speak with the sheriff. Vienna stayed behind, staring out the window. When he returned, she was on the porch, arms crossed. "Sheriff is going to ask around," he said, "but there is not much to go on." She nodded slowly. I do not want to be afraid anymore. Then do not be, he said simply. You are not alone. That night she helped him cook. They laughed quietly when she burned the potatoes. He taught her how to chop wood. She showed him how to mend a shirt sleeve proper. It was not anything grand, just small pieces of normal. But in those pieces, something gentle started to grow. By the 5th day, she was sleeping without flinching. By the 6th, her laughter came easier. On the 7th, while Paxton was brushing down the horse, she stepped up beside him and rested her hand over his. Thank you, she said. For giving me more than just safety. He looked at her, really looked. You deserve more than fear. Her hand stayed on his. Weeks passed. Vienna never left. The sheriff never found who did it. And after a while, neither of them mentioned it anymore. One evening in late September, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Vienna stood in the doorway of the barn, arms crossed over her chest. I never thought I would find something good again, she said. He came up behind her. You did. She turned. I did. When he kissed her, it was quiet and sure, like everything they had built between them finally settled into place. And that night, with the lantern light flickering low, they did not pull apart. By winter, she stood in the kitchen with her hands on her middle, a soft smile on her face. Paxton stepped in from the cold, snow in his hair. She turned to him, eyes shining. Paxton, I am carrying your child. He froze, then stepped forward, breath caught. You sure? She nodded. Yes. His hands came up to her face, then her waist, pulling her close. You are mine, Vienna. Always, she leaned into him. And you are mine. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the warmth of each other, the past behind them, the future already beginning. The snow had come early that year, blanketing the hills around Paxton's homestead in a hush that softened every sound but the firewood cracking in the hearth. Vienna stood at the window in her wool shawl, watching the flakes drift down slow and steady. Her hand rested low on her belly, more out of habit now than thought. The child moved sometimes, faint flutters that felt like a secret shared only with her. Paxton stepped in from the shed, shaking the snow from his shoulders. His boots left wet prints on the floor, but she didn't mind. Trap was sprung, he said. Fox looked like nothing left but blood and fur. Vienna turned from the window. They've grown bold lately. Maybe the cold's driven them close. He nodded, brushing his hands dry on a cloth. I'll set another further east tomorrow. Closer to the creek. She studied his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet steadiness in the way he moved through a room. He hadn't said much the night she told him about the child, but since then he'd started carving a cradle from pine, measuring it twice for good balance and sanding the corners smooth with care. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked. He looked up. Leaving where? This place, these hills. The quiet. Paxton leaned against the table. I thought about it once years back, but I never could find a place that felt more like something I could keep. Vienna stepped closer. And now I've got you, and soon someone else that depends on me. I've got no reason to go anywhere. She nodded, then reached for the kettle. The stove had warmed the kitchen to a comfort she hadn't known in years. She poured water over dried nettles and raspberry leaf. Midwife in town said this helps. Paxton took a seat at the table, watching her with quiet interest. You feel all right, most days. Some mornings are harder, but it passes. She sat across from him, cradling the warm tin cup in both hands. Tell me something about yourself I don't know yet, he raised an eyebrow. Why? Because we're building a life together and I want to know the pieces that made you. Paxton thought for a long beat. I used to play fiddle, Vienna blinked. Truly, not well, my uncle had one. I'd sneak it out when he was working the horses, played up on the ridge where no one could hear. Why'd you stop? He shrugged. The war took the sound out of me for a while, then life kept me busy fixing other things. Vienna smiled, wide and warm. We'll find you another. I doubt these hands have the nimbleness they used to, then I'll play. She took a sip of tea. My mother taught me piano, I've missed music. Paxton's eyes softened. I'd like to hear that. Later, while he chopped kindling by the barn, Vienna wandered behind the house to clear her thoughts. The air stung her cheeks, but she welcomed it. The trees stood bare and tall, the sky brushed with the pale gold of late afternoon. She followed the path Paxton had worn with his boots, the one that led to the ridge where the land dropped off into the canyon below. She stopped at the edge and looked out. The wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't move. From here, the world felt wide and still. Her life before her father's debts, her aunt's frailty, the journey west felt like another woman's story. One who hadn't yet met the man who would pull her from death and build a quiet, steady life around her. Behind her, footsteps crunched in the snow. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Paxton said, his breath visible in the cold. "I needed air." He stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "You come up here often. This is the first time." He looked out across the valley. "I used to sit here when it got too loud in my head." Something about the open makes things settle. Vienna turned to him. "I've been thinking about names." He gave a small smile. "Already," she nodded. "If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Miriam, after my mother." Paxton's gaze held hers. "And if it's a boy," she hesitated. "I thought maybe Illy." He said nothing for a moment, then reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Illy was my brother's name. He died near Shiloh." Vienna's expression softened. "I didn't know." Paxton's voice was quiet. "I think he'd like that." They stood there until the wind picked up and the light began to fade. Then he took her hand and they walked back without speaking. No words were needed. That night, she lay beside him in the bed he'd built with his own hands. The logs creaked in the walls when the wind blew hard and the fire cast long shadows across the floor. Paxton's arm was draped over her waist, his breath steady behind her. "Paxton," she whispered. I'm not afraid anymore." He pressed his lips to her shoulder. "You don't ever have to be again." She closed her eyes and let the warmth of him carry her into sleep, the child between them stirring like a promise that the long road behind had led them exactly where they were meant to be. By late March, the thaw had begun. Long fingers of meltwater traced paths down the hills, and the creek roared louder with each passing day. Paxton had taken to checking the fences each morning, should the ground shift under them. Vienna, slower now with the weight she carried, spent most of her hours by the window or in the garden beds, turning earth with a hand trowel where she could reach. She said she liked to feel things growing beneath her fingers. One morning, as he returned from the far pasture with a broken post over his shoulder, she met him at the barn door with a letter in hand. "Ryder came from town," she said. "Said this was left at the mercantile." Paxton wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Who's it from?" "There's no name." He took the envelope, turning it in his hand. The seal was nothing more than a pressed thumbprint in wax. He opened it slow, eyes narrowing as he read. Vienna waited, gaze steady. After a moment, he folded it and slipped it into his coat. "It's about the man who tied you up." Her breath stilled. "There's a name." "Not yet. But someone's asking questions in Helena, looking for a woman who disappeared on the road to Bozeman last August. Described you near exact." Vienna's voice came quiet. "How would they know I'm here?" "Sheriff might have passed word along, or someone saw you in town when we got supplies." She rubbed her wrist absently. "Do you think they'll come here?" Paxton's voice was even. "If they do, they won't get past me." That night, she sat by the stove with a worn book in her lap, though she didn't turn a page for more than an hour. Paxton carved the final piece of the cradle, setting the last joint with care. When he finished, he ran his hand along the edge and looked over. "You ever think about what kind of home you want for the child?" Vienna closed the book and set it aside. "One with peace," she said, "where they don't have to look over their shoulder, where they know they're wanted." "You think we can give them that?" "I do," she said. "With you, I do." Paxton stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. "Then we will." The following week, they rode to town together. Vienna stayed close to him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. The general store had a new bolt of calico, cornflower blue with fine white pinstripes, and she ran her fingers over it with a softness he hadn't seen in her before. "I'd like to make something for the baby," she said. "Something that's theirs first." He nodded. "Get what you need." Outside, the sheriff caught Paxton by the livery. Man came through asking about a girl from Tennessee, had a scar on his cheek long and pale, said he was her cousin, didn't sit right. Paxton kept his voice low. Where's he now? Rode out east. But he'll be back. Vienna stood beside the wagon, unaware of the exchange. Her face was turned toward the sun, and for a moment Paxton watched her in the light. He knew what it cost her to live without fear. On the ride home, she leaned against him more than usual, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her as the wagon jostled over ruts in the road. 3 nights later, the knock came just past dusk. Vienna was at the table, darning a blanket. Paxton opened the door with his rifle in hand. The man on the porch was lean, his coat worn, boots scuffed. A scar ran from his jaw to his temple. He didn't smile. Looking for someone, he said. Woman by the name of Vienna Price. Paxton didn't move. Why? She's owed a debt. Vienna stood slow, her face pale. I don't owe you anything. The man's eyes flicked toward her. Your father did. He named you as collateral when he couldn't pay. Paxton stepped fully into the doorway. You're not claiming her. She's not yours, the man said. You're wrong. The man's hand twitched near his belt, but he never got the chance. Paxton struck first, a single blow to the jaw that sent the man sprawling into the snow. When he reached for his pistol, Paxton kicked it away and stood over him. You come back here again, I won't be so generous. The man spat blood into the dirt, eyes burning, but he didn't speak. He got to his feet and stumbled toward his horse from the doorway. Vienna watched him ride off into the dark. Paxton turned to her. You all right? She nodded, hand resting low on her belly. He won't be back. No, Paxton said. He won't. Later in bed, she took his hand and placed it over the child's movement. He kicked, she whispered. Paxton's eyes widened just a little. Strong, she smiled. Like his father. He didn't speak, only held her close until the last of the fire went out, and the night wrapped around them like a promise. By mid-April, the last of the snow had melted from the north slope, leaving the earth damp and fragrant beneath new grass. Vienna moved slower now, each step measured, her balance shifting with the child heavy inside her. Paxton adjusted the barn gate to swing easier so she wouldn't struggle with the latch when she brought in the hens. He didn't say anything about it, just did it, as he always did. That morning, while she folded linens by the bed, her breath caught sharp and sudden, one hand bracing against her lower back. Paxton looked up from the firewood he was stacking. You all right? She waited a moment, the tightness passing. It's nothing. Just pulling a bit is all. He wiped his palms on his trousers and crossed the room. Do you want me to ride for the midwife? Vienna shook her head and leaned into him for a moment. Not yet. Just keep close. He stayed within arm's reach the rest of the day, sharpening tools, rethatching the chicken coop, listening for any shift in her breath. Near dusk, she sat on the back step, feet bare in the grass, and watched the sky streak orange and violet between the trees. Paxton joined her with a tin cup of water, cooled from the well. She took it with a quiet nod. Have you thought what kind of father you'll be? I reckon I'll learn when the child does, he said, but I'll be here, always. She looked down at her lap, fingers resting in the folds of her dress. I never imagined any of this before, not you, not a home that didn't feel borrowed. He didn't answer, just reached for her hand. They stayed like that while the crickets started up in the grass. The following morning, her labor began. She said little, only rose before the sun and lit the stove, her movements slow and deliberate. Paxton woke to the sound of water boiling. When he entered the kitchen, she was leaning against the counter, eyes closed, face pale. It's time, she whispered. He saddled the horse and rode fast across the ridge, finding the midwife 2 valleys over. When he returned, she was kneeling beside the bed, a folded towel pressed to her forehead. She didn't cry out, not once, though the pain had carved lines deep into her brow. The midwife, a broad woman with a voice like stone, took command without fuss. Paxton kept to the edge of the room, hands clenched useless at his sides. Vienna reached for him once, during a long silence between contractions, and he came at once, kneeling beside her. I can do this, she said, though her voice shook. I know, he said. You already are. Hours passed. The sun reached its peak and began to fall. Then, with one last cry that boiled up from somewhere deep in her chest, it was done. The child came into the world slick with birth and furious with breath. A boy, strong-limbed and dark-haired, his fists curled tight as seeds. Vienna collapsed back on the pillows, damp with sweat, her chest rising in shudders. The midwife cleaned and wrapped the baby, then handed him to her without a word. Paxton stood frozen until Vienna motioned him forward. "Come here," she said, her voice hoarse. He knelt beside them, the child now quiet against her chest. Paxton ran a knuckle gently down his son's brow. "He's yours," Vienna whispered. "Ours." He nodded, voice gone. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the child's foot, impossibly small in his palm. That night the midwife left them with instructions and a basket of herbs. Outside, the wind had shifted again, carrying the first scent of pine sap and thawed river stones. Vienna lay with the baby curled against her shoulder, his breath warm against her collar. Paxton sat at the edge of the bed, boots discarded, sleeves rolled. He watched them for a long time without speaking. She turned her head toward him. "You never asked what I was most afraid of." He looked at her, eyes steady. "What was it?" "That I'd be forgotten. That I'd pass through the world and leave nothing behind." Paxton reached out, cupped the back of her head gently. "You won't," he said. "You've made something that'll carry your name long after we're both gone." She closed her eyes. He leaned down and touched his lips to her forehead. Outside, the moon rose over the ridge, silvering the tops of the trees. Inside, the cradle stood ready beside the bed, quiet and waiting. Their son slept between them, and for the first time since the day she'd woken on the rails, Vienna dreamed without fear. Spring settled into the valley with a gentleness that surprised them both. Wildflowers pushed up near the creek, and the cottonwoods along the ridge unfurled new leaves the color of fresh butter. The days stretched longer, and Vienna took to walking the edge of the pasture in the late afternoons, the baby cradled against her chest in a sling she'd sewn from muslin. They called him Illy, just as she'd promised. He had dark eyes and a quiet way of watching things, already solemn in the crook of her arm. Paxton had built a sunshade over the porch so she could sit outside when the weather held, and there was something about the sight of her out there barefoot, humming low with the child nestled close, that made his chest ache in a way he couldn't name. One morning, while he was mending the porch rail, Vienna appeared in the doorway carrying a small leather book. "I found this in the trunk," she said. "It's my mother's. She kept notes on herbs and remedies." Paxton set down his hammer. "You thinking of using it?" "I already started." She opened to a page marked with a sprig of pressed yarrow. "There's one for coughs I remembered from when I was little. I made a tonic yesterday." He stepped closer, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You could help folks around here with that." "I'd like to, maybe not right away, but in time." She looked down at the baby, who stirred lightly in sleep. "I want to be useful again, not just to you, to the world." "You've always been," he said quietly. She didn't answer, just reached for his hand and held it a moment longer than usual. Then she turned back inside, the book clutched to her chest. That evening, after supper, he brought her a small wooden box. She opened it to find a set of carving tools, worn but sharpened to purpose. "They were my uncle's," he said. "I thought maybe you'd want to make something for Ellie with your own hands." She ran her fingers over the chisel handles. "I wouldn't know where to start." "You will." The next few weeks passed in rhythm, Paxton tending the land, Vienna learning her way through the pages of her mother's notes, Ellie sleeping and waking in his own rhythm, always with one hand curled near his cheek. Sometimes at twilight, Vienna would sit by the hearth and carve small animal shapes from kindling scraps: an owl, a fox, a mule deer. She wasn't precise yet, but her hands were steady, and Paxton kept her blades sharp. One afternoon, a rider came up the trail. Vienna was washing linens by the creek, and Paxton met the man at the gate. The stranger handed him a folded message and tipped his hat, riding off without waiting. Vienna returned just as he was reading it. "What is it?" she asked, water dripping from her sleeves. "Sheriff sent word." That man, the one with the scar, he was found dead outside Helena. Knife in the ribs. No one's claiming him. Vienna stood silent, her gaze on the hills. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Justice has its own way. Whatever came for him, it wasn't ours to carry." He folded the note and tossed it into the fire pit. "That part of your life's behind you now." "It is," she said. "It truly is." That night, as Ellie slept in his cradle beside the bed, Vienna turned toward Paxton in the dark. "I've been thinking," she whispered, "about marrying you." He leaned up on one elbow. "You have. I want it to be real. Not just what we've built here in quiet, but something known. Something that says we chose this, chose each other." He reached for her hand beneath the quilt. "I thought of asking a dozen times, but I didn't want to rush you." "You didn't." They married under the cottonwoods 3 days later, with the midwife and her husband standing witness. Vienna wore a dress she'd let down from her aunt's trunk, and Paxton shaved close for the first time in months. There was no preacher, just their vows spoken plain and true, and Ellie swaddled in his mother's arms. Afterward, they shared biscuits and smoked venison on a quilt near the creek. The water ran fast and clear beside them, and the wind stirred the grass in waves. "I never imagined this," Vienna said as she leaned into his shoulder, "but it's more than I ever hoped for." Paxton kissed her temple. "You've given me everything I didn't know I needed. I want to grow old with you. You will." Years passed and the land held them. Vienna's herb garden thrived near the kitchen door, and people came from as far as Big Timber for her remedies. She taught Ellie to read from the same book her mother had once used on her, and Paxton carved him a bow from juniper when he was old enough to steady his aim. They built a second room onto the cabin, and then a third. More children came, 1 girl, 2 more boys, and the cradle was passed from one to the next, worn smooth at the edges by love. Paxton's hair turned silver at the temples, and Vienna's hands grew calloused from work and time. But their evenings stayed the same quiet, warm, filled with the kind of peace that only comes from surviving the long road and finding home at the end of it. One summer evening, many years after the snow had melted from that first spring together, Vienna stood barefoot in the garden, watching the sun slip low behind the ridge. Paxton came up behind her, his arm settling around her waist. "The boys are down by the creek," she said. "Anna's helping your sister in the kitchen." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "It's a good life." "It is." She turned to face him, her hands finding his. "Thank you for giving it to me." He shook his head. "You were the one who made it grow." They kissed as the light faded, the scent of wild thyme and sweetgrass rising around them. Behind them, laughter echoed from the house, the kind that only comes from a place built over time with hands and heart and quiet, steady love. And in that moment, nothing was missing. Nothing left undone, only the soft hush of the land holding them and the warmth of a life finally wholly lived.